Mrs. Cécile Saboureau, Vice President for International Affairs of Université Côte d'Azur, Patrick Vail, Founder and President of Bibliothèques Sans Frontières, Jean-Christophe Martin, Professor, University of Côte d'Azur and Director of the Institut de la Paix du Développement, distinguished panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen. I would really like to express my sincere gratitude and thanks to Université Côte d'Azur and Bibliothèques Sans Frontières for organizing this very important symposium and for shining the spotlight on a very difficult and painful subject, which is the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence, often referred to as the oldest crime of war and the world's least reported and least condemned crime. Sexual violence during conflict used as a tactic of war, terrorism, and political repression is one of the most devastating forms of violence committed mainly against women and girls, but also against men and boys. It is an invisible, cheap, and effective weapon of war. Cheap and almost cost-free, because perpetrators know that survivors will not report due to stigma and shame, fear of reprisal, fear of rejection, amongst other reasons, and that they will enjoy total impunity. Effective, because it is intended to shred society's fabric, to dehumanize, destabilize the enemy, and it does destroy not only the victims, but their families and societies. It shatters lives and livelihoods with consequences that echo across generations, including in the plight of children born of wartime rape. This symposium is timely in providing a space for strategic reflection on what we know and what is missing from research, policy, and practice. And I recall back in 2017 when I was interviewed for this position, one of the first things that I flagged was the knowledge gaps that I felt that was associated with this mandate, that there is so much more that we don't know. And I said to the interview panel that one of the things that I would like to do for this mandate, if I'm selected, was to precisely establish a research hub. And I'm so grateful to have this partnership with you, Patrick and Jean-Christophe, because I think now more than ever before, there is a need for a research hub where we have to focus on the missing links. I'll speak briefly about the evolution of the mandate and how it is constantly very volatile, because there's so much happening. And as Patrick mentioned, we see how sexual violence continues to be used, and we really need a surgical analysis of what's going on. The mandate was established through the unanimous adoption of Security Council Resolution 1888 in 2009 to tackle conflict-related sexual violence as a peace and security issue. And the Council recognized the widespread and systematic use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, and it committed to bring all tools available to bear, including political, economic, judicial, and coercive measures to ensure the cessation of violations, and the reign of impunity. I mean, just imagine, we're talking about a crime that has existed since the history of war, and it's only in 2009 that the Security Council saw wars through the eyes of women whose bodies have been part of the battlefield since the history of war. And my role as special representative is to provide coherent and strategic leadership to global efforts, to engage in political advocacy with governments, including military, police, and judicial officials, to engage with all parties to conflict, both state and non-state armed groups, and other strategic partners, including religious leaders, traditional leaders, and civil society organizations. And just to show how the mandate has evolved, the Security Council, subsequent to 2009, has adopted other very important resolutions, specifically on conflict-related sexual violence, not less than 5 of them. And for example, I just mentioned a couple. Resolution 2331 that was adopted in 2016, which condemns sexual violence as an act of terrorism. And that was a direct response to transnational terrorist groups such as ISIS that had actually reduced women and girls to an expendable currency in the political economy of war. But there's also Boko Haram and others. And the last resolution, 2467, specifically on sexual violence, was in 2019, which my office had the opportunity of working very, very closely in terms of its drafting with the government of Germany, really marked a turning point in terms of calling for a holistic approach centered on survivors' rights, needs, and wishes that ensures their full and meaningful participation in the decisions that affect their lives, and also for the first time recognize children born of sexual violence in conflict as right holders. When I took office in 2017, I set my own strategic priorities, like 3 of them, and they were all included in that Security Council resolution, including the survivor-centered approach and the issue of children born of rape, which I'll be speaking about a little bit later. In terms of how I do my work, my operational methodology is to secure commitments with national authorities in affected countries to prevent and address sexual violence, and to anchor these commitments at the highest level through concrete implementation plans and strategies. And to date, my office has signed agreements with 12 countries, the last one being in Ukraine in May 2022. And since I took office, my 3 strategic priorities for the mandate have been, firstly, prevention through justice and accountability, converting cultures of impunity into cultures of justice and accountability as a deterrent. Secondly, prevention through addressing the root causes with gender inequality, marginalization, poverty, exploitation of natural resources as some of its invisible drivers. And secondly, having a survivor-centered approach. I said when I took office that the mandate has the face of a survivor and was created for survivors. Women and girls significantly impacted, but also men and boys. And the survivor-centered approach that I have been advocating views survivors not as passive beneficiaries, but as co-creators of solution. So while we have a significant normative framework and that there has been normative progress achieved at the global level, as Patrick rightly pointed out, words on paper are unfortunately not yet matched by facts on the ground. And if civilians continue to suffer sexual violence in situations of armed conflict, it is not for a lack of international norms or institutions to protect them. It is because existing norms are not adequately implemented and enforced. It is because existing institutions are not backed with sustained political and financial support. The primary function of my office is to prepare the annual report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, which serves as a global advocacy instrument and an official public record. The last report, covering the year 2022, paints a very disturbing picture of sexual violence being used as a tactic of war, torture, terrorism, and also political repression. And the gap between commitments and compliance, between resolutions and reality, is evident on every page of the annual report, which really surface very, very painful human stories, from mass abduction and rape in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the rape of 16 women during an attack on a mining site, to brutal gang rapes of women in Tigray, Ethiopia, with one woman being raped by 27 Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers. And that conflict alone has left more than 10,000 survivors of sexual violence in desperate need of assistance and redress. The current preparation of the 2023 report, which will be debated before the Security Council in April, indicates the same trends. And in 2023, I had to conduct 5 field missions. I went to Ukraine, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and South Sudan, but also I went to the border with Sudan. And this Sunday, I will be traveling to Israel to gather facts relating to allegations of sexual violence during the attacks of 7th of October, and will also engage with the Palestinian Authority and other relevant authorities in the occupied West Bank. The reality is that we meet at a time when conflict-related sexual violence is again in our daily headlines, and its unabated brutality on our 21st century battlefields and its recurrence with each new wave of warfare continues to shock the collective conscience of humanity. We are going through a massive and global turbulence marked by multiple cascading crises, an epidemic of coup, and the highest number of conflicts since World War II, with over 110 million people now displaced. More than 600 million women and girls live in conflict-affected countries. We see how militarization and authoritarianism are on the march, resulting in shrinking civic space, virulent backlash on gender equality, and rising reprisals against human rights defenders and journalists who bring atrocity crimes to the attention of the world. We also see an array of new actors, such as mercenaries and private military and security companies, which are complicating attribution and accountability on contemporary battlefields. There's also climate-driven insecurity and displacement, which is increasing intercommunal violence, including sexual violence, in contexts like Somalia, South Sudan, and others. And on the other hand, at the same time, the security umbrella for humanitarian protection and assistance activities is closing as peacekeeping missions are drawing down in contexts like Mali, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Ukraine, I heard firsthand the accounts of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers. The ages of the victims range from just 4 to 84 years old. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine also provided chilling details of sexual violence affecting victims of all ages. Russian armed forces raping girls when entering or occupying civilian homes, children raped, tortured, unlawfully confined, killed and injured, an 83-year-old woman raped by a Russian armed force serviceman in her house in the presence of her physically disabled husband. In Sudan, since the conflict erupted on 15th of April between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Services, sexual violence against displaced and refugee women and girls has dramatically increased. Sexual violence remains a prominent feature of the unbroken cycles of violence in Darfur, where women's bodies are on the front lines of conflict. Young women have been abducted from dormitories and hospitals, shackled and transported in the back of pickups by fighters to be sold in slave markets in northern Darfur. Last September, I visited the border area where I met with several Sudanese victims, including a 7-year-old girl who, after fleeing with her grandmother, was raped in the refugee camp. In June of last year, I visited Eastern DRC, where I met many women and girls who had been recently raped, and they stressed the daily risk of sexual violence while undertaking livelihood activities such as searching for food or collecting wood and water. And these women faced an impossible choice: between economic subsistence and sexual violence, between their livelihoods and their lives. But I must say that it's not all doom and gloom. Although the challenges remain daunting and new protection crises continue to emerge, we do see some signs of hope amidst this global turmoil. My office continues to engage with the authorities at the highest level to offer technical assistance and support in line with the agreements we have signed. We closely monitor all situations of concern, calling for restraint, unimpeded humanitarian access, comprehensive service provision, and effective investigation. Despite significant funding shortfalls, the two operational arms of my mandate, the team of experts on the rule of law, and UN Action Network, which comprise of 25 UN entities working together to deliver as one UN, are supporting governments to implement these formal agreements and reaching, I must say, countless previously unreachable or invisible victims. The team of experts works closely with affected governments to support the investigation, the prosecution, the adjudication of crimes under both civilian and military systems. They also work on legislative reform, focusing on protection of victims and witnesses. They're currently supporting the national authorities and justice sector in no less than 12 countries. Over the past few years, we have noted a number of very encouraging developments in the area of justice and accountability, as well as legislative reform from the DRC to South Sudan to Central African Republic, Guinea, Iraq, and Colombia. A few examples include the opening in Guinea of a landmark trial on 28th of September 2022, exactly 13 years, day for day, after a stadium massacre by the military, which left at least 157 protesters dead and 109 women and girls victims of sexual violence, with the country's former coup leader, Moussa Dadis Camara, and other ministers among those charged. In Iraq, the Council of Representatives adopted the Yazidi Survivors Law, which provides reparations and other forms of support to victims of Daesh atrocities. In Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has opened a dedicated case on sexual and gender-based violence. In Nigeria in 2022, sexual violence was included for the first time in an indictment against Boko Haram, contributing to evolving understanding and jurisprudence on sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism. In Ukraine, the Office of the Prosecutor General has established a specialized unit on conflict-related sexual violence, and my team of experts is providing training and operational support to the specialized unit. UN Action Network has also leveraged its role to engage in programmatic efforts, joint advocacy, and knowledge building to better prevent and respond to sexual violence. Just last year, they implemented projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and Ukraine to support survivors in their recovery and strengthen and build the capacities of local stakeholders, including governments and civil society organizations. In total, the UN Action Network has supported more than 50 projects across 18 conflict-affected settings since 2009. Moving forward, it's clear that when history looks back on these painful episodes as part of the long litany of battles fought in the bodies of women and girls, we will rightly be asked what we did to honor our commitments. And in this regard, I wish to highlight just a few initiatives and tools developed by my office to build the skills and will for effective action to combat this heinous crime. Firstly, we launched a prevention framework. As I mentioned, survivors are my moral compass in the execution of my mandate. And in fact, in all countries where I meet survivors, they repeat the same message to me, that what happened to them could have been prevented. And indeed, sexual violence is preventable. It's not an inevitable byproduct of war. It's not collateral damage. But unfortunately, for too long, we have been on a reactive mode, focusing primarily on intervening with affected individuals and helping survivors after the violence has occurred. Accordingly, in 2022, I launched a prevention framework which aims to enhance both structural and operational prevention. And the framework is being rolled out in countries falling within the purview of my mandate. My office also launched model legislative provisions and guidance on investigation and prosecution. By the way, we have copies which Lindsay can share with any one of you who is interested to have a copy. In many countries, national legislation lacks a comprehensive legal framework that recognizes all forms of sexual violence as crimes. And of course, weaknesses in law allows perpetrators to escape punishment and deny victims the right to a remedy. So in 2021, we launched these model legislative provisions, which contain state-of-the-art legal provisions required to prosecute any form of sexual violence. And again, my team of experts is currently supporting a number of countries in their legislative reform process and is rolling out this model legislation. I mentioned earlier children born of rape, and it's a fact, maybe very invisible, that throughout history and across diverse geographic spaces and contexts, children have been born of sexual violence in war and conflict zones, and everywhere they are stigmatized by traumatized post-conflict societies as children of the enemy. They have all kinds of names, from Boko Haram snakes, and they are marginalized and rejected within and outside families and exposed to a range of physical, psychosocial, economic, cultural, and legal risk and harm. And really, I was terribly disturbed by what I observed firsthand during my mission to Nigeria, precisely with these Boko Haram babies, in Iraq, but also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I met with these children who were adult, about the extent to which they and their mothers are stigmatized. And that led me to intensify my advocacy on the subject, which resulted in Resolution 2467, recognizing for the first time their existence as rights holders, distinct from their mothers under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also connected to their mothers under the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, for example, related to nationality laws. I was also mandated by the Security Council to prepare a special report for the Secretary General, which report is before the Council and sets out a platform of legal, policy, and operational recommendations. And I'm glad to say that work is already underway in a number of countries for the implementation of these recommendations. And that's how we get the mandate to evolve. Impunity for wartime rape remains the rule, and accountability the rare exception. And to break the vicious cycle of violence and impunity, we really must use all the diplomatic and enforcement tools at our disposal. And that's why, since I took office, I have been advocating for sanctions. And I have been really pushing for sanctions and judicial accountability measures to work hand in hand. And accordingly, I have been and I continue to regularly brief sanctions committees and making recommendations for targeted sanctions in the form of travel bans, asset freeze, and arms embargo, which I must say work. And I can give a concrete example of how I got Dr. Rick Mashar, who was the commander-in-chief of SPLA, in opposition to release like 500 women and girls which were abducted by some of his military commanders in 3 different ways. So sanctions really it can be a very strong tool. I also strongly advocate for reparations because international law recognizes the right of victims to a remedy and reparations. And while reparations are really the most victim-centered justice mechanism and really the most significant means of making a difference in the lives of victims, it remains the justice intervention that survivors demand most, yet receive least. And my team of experts is currently supporting a number of countries, including the DRC, to adopt legislation on reparations and to establish national reparations fund from Iraq to DRC to Ukraine and other countries. My office is also continuously expanding its circle of allies through frameworks of cooperation with a range of stakeholders, from treaty bodies to interparliamentary union or Religion for Peace. Forged partnership with a number of private sector actors, NGOs, and academic institutions. And it is, of course, in this vein that I'm here today as a result of our recent partnership with Bibliothèques Sans Frontières. In 2019, I also launched a Global Champion Initiative, and I'm currently in the process of establishing a Youth Ambassador Initiative to empower the young voices who are at the forefront of this work. And I do intend to talk to you, Patrick and Jean-Christophe, into how we can further this initiative. In conclusion, I just want to say that we stand at a crossroad in the history of addressing sexual violence in conflict. And we have a clear choice to make. Either to defend the gains we have made over the past decade and turn commitments into compliance and resolutions into solutions, or to retreat in the face of the new conflict that have erupted on almost every continent. But if we are truly committed to eradicating the scourge of sexual violence in a sustained and meaningful way, we must confront the reality that implementation is grossly lagging behind and that this rule-based international order is under severe threat. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda has a transformative potential with its robust normative framework that reaffirmed that sexual violence in conflict can be prevented if we act decisively and boldly. It reminds us of the responsibility that we bear to care for survivors of these heinous crimes. We know which path we are duty-bound to take. As we navigate the long and winding road from rhetoric to reality, the plight and rights of survivors must be our moral compass. We must rise to the challenge of our times because inaction is not an option. Survivors need more than our solidarity. They need tangible support in the form of accountability, reparations, and economic reintegration, as well as significant investment in structural prevention. Member states must recommit to ensuring that the robust global framework is no more an empty promise. Protection from sexual violence, even in the midst of war, is not merely an aspiration, it is a legal obligation. By helping to disseminate and socialize good practices and lessons learned, every expert in this room can help to maintain momentum to eradicate and spare succeeding generations from this scourge. 15 years after the creation of my mandate, we owe the survivors no less. Let us seize this opportunity for decisive, united action that is commensurate to the scale of the challenge. Thank you.